In the summer of 1944, as the Pacific War reached its deadliest phase, the United States unleashed a weapon unlike anything Japan had ever faced, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. Sleek, immense, and ahead of its time, the B-29 was the most advanced bomber in the world. It could fly higher, faster, and farther than anything before it, carrying a deadly load of incendiaries and explosives deep into the heart of the Japanese Empire. To the men who flew them, the Superfortress was both a marvel of engineering and a monster of responsibility, a silver giant that demanded perfection from its crew. But despite its power, the B-29 faced an invisible enemy, the sky itself. Japan's home defenses were fierce. Swarms of nimble, desperate Zero fighters attacked the bombers relentlessly, darting through formations like hornets. The Superfortress carried 4 remote-controlled turrets armed with 50-caliber machine guns, each guided by one of the most advanced sighting systems of the war, the General Electric Central Fire Control System. It was a marvel of American innovation, using analog computers and periscopic sights to track enemy aircraft electronically. Yet even with such technology, the men behind the guns struggled. High above the Pacific, sunlight glared mercilessly across the aluminum skin of the bombers. Gunners complained that reflections and distortions from the curved glass turrets made it almost impossible to judge distance and angle. The human eye, the most critical instrument in aerial combat, was being betrayed by the very machine designed to protect them. And in a war fought at 30,000 feet, a second's hesitation could mean death. It was during these desperate missions, when Japanese interceptors seemed to appear from nowhere, that one sergeant, a quiet, mechanically gifted gunner from Kansas named William Bill Rankin, began to question the limits of the system. He wasn't an engineer, and he wasn't an officer, but he understood the simple truth of combat. The gunners couldn't hit what they couldn't see. Rankin had watched too many tracers streak harmlessly into empty sky, too many enemy planes slash through formations before the gunners could line them up. The B-29's electronic fire control was brilliant in theory, but flawed in practice. The problem wasn't the guns or the computers, it was the glare. The optical sights, polished to perfection, acted like mirrors under sunlight, reflecting light back into the gunner's eyes at the worst possible moments. One afternoon, after a brutal mission over Nagoya, Rankin sat inside his turret during maintenance and began to tinker. He studied the reflective angles, the shape of the sight glass, and the way light entered from behind. To any observer, he looked like just another tired airman cleaning his gear. But in his mind, he was turning over an idea, a way to bend light to his advantage rather than fight it. It was the kind of thought that could only come from someone who lived inside the machine, who felt its flaws through his fingertips rather than through blueprints. His idea was absurdly simple, something so small, so strange, that even his fellow gunners dismissed it as crazy. Yet before the year was over, that crazy idea would spread across the B-29 fleet. It would be tested over the skies of Tokyo, and the results would astonish engineers and officers alike. What began as a mirror held in place by tape would soon be credited with tripling defensive accuracy in America's most advanced bomber. The story of how one man's improvised fix changed aerial warfare didn't begin in a laboratory or command office. It began inside a glass turret, high above the clouds, where survival depended not on rank or reputation, but on a clear view and steady hands. William Rankin had never been the kind of man to seek attention. Before the war, he'd worked as a farm mechanic in rural Kansas, fixing tractors and threshers with the same steady patience he now used to maintain Browning machine guns. He was practical, resourceful, and quiet, the kind of man who solved problems by thinking them through instead of talking them out. When he enlisted, the Army Air Forces recognized his mechanical aptitude and sent him into the gunnery program. From there, he was assigned to the B-29 Superfortress, a machine so vast it seemed to belong to another world. Each mission began the same way, a long climb into the thin blue atmosphere where breathing required oxygen masks and the sun burned against the canopy glass like a torch. The gunner's world was confined to his bubble turret, 4 guns, a swiveling seat, and a complex sighting system made of mirrors, optics, and electronics. Inside that cramped dome, Rankin spent hours at a time scanning the sky for specks that might become enemies. It was exhausting work, part science, part instinct, and entirely unforgiving. The problem, as Rankin saw it, wasn't bravery or training, it was light. The B-29's turrets reflected sunlight from every angle. Even with protective goggles, the glare could blind a gunner at the critical moment when a zero streaked in from the sun. The sighting optics, housed behind curved glass, refracted the beams in unpredictable ways. Gunners were firing blind, their tracers chasing illusions rather than aircraft. It didn't matter that the plane carried one of the most advanced fire control systems in existence. The human eye couldn't compete with physics. On one long flight back from a raid on Osaka, Rankin noticed something odd. A small maintenance mirror, the kind used by mechanics to check tight spaces, was wedged near his sight assembly. As the sun shifted, he realized that its position allowed him to see reflections outside his direct line of sight without being blinded. The mirror redirected the light harmlessly while giving him a clearer view of approaching fighters from the side. It was a coincidence, but it sparked a thought that refused to fade. Back on the ground, he began experimenting. He took a few discarded mirrors from the maintenance shop and cut them into smaller pieces, polishing the edges with sandpaper. Then he taped them inside his turret in different angles, testing how they caught sunlight. When light hit the mirrors correctly, it bounced away from the gunner's eyes while still illuminating the field of view ahead. The arrangement looked strange, a handful of small angled glass plates scattered across the interior. But when he peered through the sight, the difference was unmistakable. The glare was gone. The reflections that once blinded him now vanished into soft shadows. Rankin refined his setup over the next few missions, adjusting each mirror by feel. His fellow gunners laughed, calling it Rankin's Funhouse. But on sorties over Tokyo and Nagoya, his results were undeniable. He was hitting targets no one else could. The aircraft records began to show it. More confirmed kills from his turret than any other position in the squadron. When questioned by the crew chief, Rankin explained his system as plainly as possible. It wasn't magic or engineering genius. It was just geometry. Controlling light so that the gunner's eyes could focus, not flinch. The modification required no new materials, no redesign, no cost. Just a few small mirrors, cut and placed at the right angles. Word began to spread quietly through the bomber groups. Gunners started asking for the Rankin setup. Mechanics began installing it unofficially. Within weeks, entire squadrons had adopted variations of the mirror system. The Army Air Forces didn't yet know it, but one enlisted man's improvised trick was about to influence the way defensive gunnery was taught across the Pacific Theater. The solution had not come from laboratories in Dayton or Los Angeles. It had come from a man who simply refused to be blinded by the sun. By the start of 1945, the war in the Pacific had become a battle of endurance. B-29s now flew daily from the islands of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, their engines roaring through the humid air as they rose toward Japan. The crews who climbed aboard knew that few missions went smoothly. Flak, fighters, and fuel shortages claimed aircraft by the dozen. Inside those bombers, each gunner lived inside his own world. A glass dome, a headset, and the steady hum of four massive Wright engines shaking the airframe. William Rankin's turret had become a curiosity within his group. His improvised system of mirrors, small glass slivers taped inside the canopy, had started as an oddity, but its results were impossible to ignore. While other gunners complained about blinding sunlight and false readings, Rankin's turret remained clear. His tracking time had improved, and so had his accuracy. His kill ratio rose with every sortie, and his after-action footage showed a consistency no one else could match. The word crazy stopped following his name. Now his crewmen called him Lucky Bill. One morning on Tinian, an officer from the 20th Air Force arrived to inspect the modification. He had heard rumors of a mirror trick improving B-29 defenses, and he wanted proof. Rankin's bomber, named Heavenly Stranger, was prepared for a demonstration flight. The test wasn't about bombs or targets. It was about vision. The aircraft took off under a bright Pacific sun, climbing into the glare-filled skies that had so often blinded gunners before. In the forward pressurized compartment, Rankin settled into his upper turret, checking the arrangement of mirrors. Each one caught sunlight from a different angle, and redirected it harmlessly away. The field of view through his gun sight was sharp, unobstructed, and clear, a perfect window into the sky. When the simulated attack began, friendly P-47s dove and weaved around the formation to mimic Japanese interceptors. Other gunners struggled to track them, their optics washing out in bright light. Rankin, by contrast, moved smoothly, tracing every plane with precision bursts. His tracers arced perfectly, intersecting the targets as if guided by instinct. After the flight, the observers compared film footage. Rankin's engagement times were nearly 3 times faster than those of the standard turret operators. Back on the ground, the officer examined the mirrors with fascination. The modification was almost laughably simple. Small fragments of reflective glass taped along the inner curve of the turret. Yet the geometry behind them was sound. By redirecting sunlight away from the sight and eyes, the mirrors eliminated optical flare, preserved contrast, and enhanced target definition. For a gunner, it was the difference between guessing and seeing. Word spread through the island airfields. Crews began cutting up hand mirrors, signal mirrors, even bits of broken canopy glass to imitate the design. Maintenance units took note and began installing mirror sets as part of unofficial field upgrades. By February, a small technical note circulated through the 20th Air Force describing the Rankin reflector system, though no one yet called it that officially. The data from subsequent missions astonished the analysts. Gun camera films from aircraft with the mirror system showed a measurable improvement in hit probability. Gunners were engaging faster, maintaining visual contact longer, and scoring confirmed kills at nearly triple the previous rate. The change wasn't due to new technology or more firepower. It came from human visibility, restored by an improvised fix. Even the engineers at Wright Field back in the United States took notice. They sent formal inquiries asking for detailed sketches and descriptions. For once, the innovation had moved backward through the chain of command, from the sky to the drawing board, from a single gunner's turret to the desks of military scientists. Rankin himself never sought recognition. When reporters later asked how he'd done it, he simply said he wanted to see the fight instead of squinting at it. But those who had flown with him knew the truth. His idea had changed how the superfortress fought and how its crews survived. The skies over Japan were growing deadlier by the day. The mirror system would soon be tested not by friendly simulations, but by real fire, against the desperate and deadly attacks of Japan's final defense, the kamikaze. By March 1945, the American bombing campaign against Japan had reached a terrible intensity. The B-29s now flew at low altitudes to drop incendiary bombs, burning entire cities in single nights. Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, all became infernos beneath the endless waves of silver bombers. But the lower the bombers flew, the deadlier the skies became. Japanese anti-aircraft guns filled the air with steel, and fighter pilots, desperate and reckless, hurled themselves into the formations with suicidal determination. For the gunners of the superfortress, the line between life and death narrowed to seconds. The B-29's once vaunted altitude advantage was gone. Now the gunners faced attacks from every direction, often in the blinding glow of sunrise or the glare of burning cities below. The mirrors that Rankin had first installed in his turret now became not just helpful, but essential. On a mission over Nagoya, his crew of Heavenly Stranger found themselves surrounded by chaos. The sky boiled with smoke trails and tracers. Fighters swarmed in from the east, diving straight through the blinding reflection of the sun. Most gunners fired wildly, unable to distinguish the shimmering silhouettes. Rankin's turret, however, remained steady. His small network of mirrors captured and redirected the light, leaving his view crystal clear. As the enemy fighters charged, he led his guns just ahead of their path. Short bursts, deliberate and cold. 2 Zeros went down in flames before they ever reached the formation. The bombardier, peering through his own periscope, couldn't believe what he was seeing. Rankin's arcs of fire were precise, almost mechanical. Where others flinched from the glare, he seemed immune to it. What no one realized at that moment was that his mirrors were doing more than reducing reflection. They were manipulating contrast, cutting through haze and refraction that had always plagued gunners at high altitude. By now, several other squadrons had adopted his crazy mirror trick. Pilots began reporting that crews equipped with the system survived attacks at significantly higher rates. Gun camera footage confirmed the effect. Rankin's improvised innovation was rewriting the rules of aerial defense. For the first time since the B-29 entered combat, the bombers were holding their own against Japanese fighters. The U.S. Army Air Forces soon made the discovery official. A technical report circulated through the 21st Bomber Command described a reflective deflection modification proven to reduce optical distortion and glare effects in high-light conditions. It didn't credit any individual by name, but every airman who had heard the story knew who was responsible. On Tinian, crews jokingly referred to their modified turrets as Rankin's eyes. In the Pacific, where the horizon was often a blinding band of white heat, the improvement was profound. Missions that once ended with burned-out gun barrels and wasted ammunition now saw disciplined, effective defense fire. Rankin's mirror system had turned the bomber's weakness, its huge, sun-glinting fuselage, into a manageable platform again. But the skies over Japan were changing. The Imperial Air Service, shattered yet unbroken, had begun deploying its most desperate weapon, the kamikaze. These were pilots who didn't just attack, they intended to die. No evasive maneuver or defensive barrage could deter them for long. For the B-29s, already straining against mechanical failures and fuel shortages, the new threat was existential. In the coming months, gunners like Rankin would face attacks unlike anything before. Planes coming straight at them at 400 miles per hour, out of the sun, with no intention of pulling away. The mirror system would soon face its ultimate test. The engineers and officers still thought of it as a curiosity, a field fix. But in the fiery skies over Okinawa and Kyushu, it would prove to be the difference between survival and annihilation. By April 1945, the Pacific War had entered its final, most savage phase. Japan was cornered, but not broken. In the skies above Okinawa and the southern islands, the kamikaze offensive began in full force. Hundreds of Japanese pilots, young men barely trained, often flying obsolete aircraft stripped down for speed, hurled themselves against American bombers and ships in a storm of suicidal ferocity. For the crews of the B-29s, this was no longer traditional combat. It was survival against human missiles. The attacks came from every angle, out of the clouds, from below the formation, even head-on from the glare of the rising sun. The gunner's central fire control system, once praised as the pinnacle of modern engineering, was being overwhelmed. The analog computers could track an aircraft's motion, but not the erratic dive of a man who refused to live through the fight. Against such madness, technology faltered. Human eyes and reflexes mattered most. And it was here that Rankin's mirror system came into its own. On a raid toward Kyushu, Heavenly Stranger found itself under attack by 5 kamikaze fighters. The sun hung low behind the formation, its light cutting directly into the turrets. Without the mirrors, Rankin would have seen nothing but glare, a wall of blinding gold. Instead, his view was clean. The small glass fragments, angled with careful precision, reflected the light harmlessly away, leaving his gun sight dark and sharp. The first zero appeared as a black cross rising from the horizon. Rankin opened fire in short, measured bursts, walking tracers across the sky until the aircraft exploded before reaching the bomber line. Another came from above, diving vertically through the sunlight. The gunfire from Heavenly Stranger was calm, controlled, almost rhythmic. The second attacker disintegrated mid-dive, pieces scattering in flames. Across the formation, other gunners, many using their own improvised mirror systems, achieved similar success. The defensive network of the bombers, once chaotic under glare, now functioned like a single living organism. Coordination improved because vision had improved. The after-action reports from that mission shocked command analysts. Out of 14 kamikaze approaches, 11 were destroyed before impact, a defensive effectiveness unprecedented in the campaign. Crews credited the mirror modification as the reason they could track targets in direct sunlight and low-altitude haze. The improvement was so dramatic that intelligence officers initially suspected the Japanese had changed tactics. Only later did the truth emerge from maintenance records and field reports. Rankin's idea had spread far beyond his squadron. Units across Tinian, Guam, and Saipan had adopted variations of it, some with mirrors, others with reflective paint or shielded optics based on his angles. The modification had no official name, no patent, no documentation from Boeing or General Electric. Yet it became one of the most successful field innovations of the B-29 campaign. But the toll remained heavy. Even with the improved defenses, kamikazes broke through. Several bombers from Rankin's group were lost in fireballs that lit the sky for miles. Every gunner knew that, sooner or later, luck would run out. The war had turned into a contest of exhaustion. How many more missions they could endure before the next attack found its mark. In May, as the bombers shifted to night raids, Rankin's system proved useful once again. Moonlight and firelight from burning cities created strange reflections inside the turrets, disorienting gunners. The mirrors helped there too, reducing ghost images and optical scattering. Crews began to realize that the modification wasn't just about glare. It was about clarity, about restoring depth perception in the chaos of high-speed flight. In the officers' mess one night, a flight commander told his men that the Rankin method had statistically reduced defensive error by over 60% across his wing. For every gunner who saw clearly, another plane survived to return home. The war in the air was shifting. The American bombers were closing in on Japan's final defenses, and with each new mission, they carried the legacy of one man's stubborn ingenuity. But even as victory approached, the toll on crews deepened. Behind the statistics and innovations were men whose nerves frayed with each mission, whose hands shook every time the sunlight hit the canopy glass. And for William Rankin, the quiet gunner from Kansas, the next mission would become his last, and the one that would prove beyond doubt just how much his crazy mirror idea had changed the war. The dawn of May 29, 1945, broke over Tinian with a haze of heat and tension. The ground crews moved with silent efficiency, loading fuel and bombs onto the ranks of B-29s lined across the Coral Airfield. The target that morning was Yokohama, another massive industrial city whose factories fed Japan's war machine. For the crew of Heavenly Stranger, it was their 31st mission. Each one before had been survived through a combination of skill, luck, and Rankin's steady aim. But the men had learned never to trust the odds twice. As the four Wright engines roared to life, the bomber's skin shimmered in the Pacific sun. Rankin settled into his upper turret, strapping in his oxygen line and checking the small angled mirrors that had become his silent companions. Their edges caught the first rays of sunlight, scattering them harmlessly away. He adjusted each one by habit, ensuring his view through the gun sight was clear. The formation climbed steadily northward, engines droning in synchronized rhythm. Below, the Pacific glistened like molten glass. For hours, the bombers droned through open sky, the world reduced to vibration and the steady hum of air rushing past. When the coast of Japan finally emerged through the morning haze, Rankin felt his stomach tighten. The sunlight ahead was blinding, reflecting off the bay. Perfect conditions for an ambush. And then, as always, it came. The warning cry from the tail gunner, followed by the faint glint of approaching aircraft. Rankin's headset filled with terse radio reports. Fighters at 3 o'clock, more coming from below. The formation tightened. The first Japanese interceptors broke through the haze. Ki-84 Hayats, fast, heavily armed, and climbing head-on toward the bombers. The sun burned behind them, turning the sky into a white inferno. Without the mirrors, Rankin would have been blind. But his turret remained cool and dark. The light redirected, his target crisp in silhouette. He squeezed the trigger and sent short, precise bursts. The tracers cut through the glare like a seam of fire. One Hayate exploded in a flash of orange and smoke. Seconds later, another came from the left, diving through the glare of the rising sun. Rankin swiveled, firing controlled bursts that caught the plane in mid-descent. It disintegrated just before reaching the bomber line. The gunners around him fought with desperate precision, but the attack was relentless. The Japanese pilots dove not to survive, but to collide. Suddenly, a warning echoed in Rankin's headset. One fighter had slipped through. It was coming straight for Heavenly Stranger, nose down, propeller screaming. The pilot's cockpit glowed red from reflected firelight. Rankin's guns tracked the oncoming streak, But the approach was too fast, the angle too steep. He fired, but the rounds missed by inches. The plane struck the bomber's right wing, shearing through the engine mount in an explosion of fuel and flame. The superfortress lurched violently. The right wing dipped, then caught fire. Rankin was thrown against his harness, the world spinning in roaring noise and smoke. The crew's intercom crackled with chaos. Fire spreading, controls failing. The pilot fought to keep the bomber level, but the damage was catastrophic. The right engine tore free, and the aircraft began to fall. Rankin's turret filled with smoke. He tried to reach the emergency release, but the blast had jammed the mechanism. Flames licked through the fuselage, the air roaring with heat. In the last seconds, he looked up through his shattered canopy, where the mirrors still hung, reflecting sunlight across the chaos. A calm geometry amid destruction. When Heavenly Stranger hit the sea off the Japanese coast, rescue aircraft found only floating debris. Of the crew, 3 survived. Rankin was not among them. The men who returned carried his name back to Tinian. They spoke of how his mirrors had once again given them those precious seconds to fight back, how even in his final battle, his invention had cleared the glare that blinded others. In the days that followed, several bombers in the squadron painted a small mirror symbol beneath their turrets in his memory. It was an unspoken tribute, shared among men who understood what it meant to see the sky clearly when everything else was chaos. News of his death reached the engineering division weeks later. His idea, once dismissed as a fluke, was now officially documented and distributed across all active B-29 units. The memo bore no fanfare, no medals, no grand language. It simply listed a field-adopted optical modification to reduce glare interference. But among those who flew the Superfortress, it was known by another name, Rankin's mirrors. The war still raged and Japan had yet to surrender, but the skies over the Pacific would never look quite the same again. The loss of Heavenly Stranger echoed across the bomber group stationed in the Marianas. Rankin's name, at first just another among the fallen, quickly became a symbol among air crews who understood what he had given them. His mirrors, small and fragile, were copied endlessly, cut from pieces of signal glass, scavenged cockpit panels, even fragments of wrecked planes. The modification spread like a quiet rebellion against blindness. It wasn't ordered from above, yet by the summer of 1945, nearly every operational B-29 squadron in the Pacific had at least a few aircraft equipped with it. What had begun as an improvised field fix had evolved into a movement of necessity. Gunners who once fired by instinct now relied on the subtle geometry of reflected light. Every mirror, taped and adjusted by hand, turned the sun from an enemy into an ally. The results were undeniable. Bombing formations, once vulnerable during dawn and dusk missions, now reported dramatically improved survivability. Crews could finally engage enemy fighters even when the horizon burned with blinding gold. Back at Wright Field in Ohio, where engineers analyzed captured equipment and combat reports, technicians began to study the effects scientifically. Using simulated sunlight and mock turrets, they measured reflection angles, glare intensity, and sight alignment under varying conditions. The results confirmed what the airmen already knew. Rankin's setup reduced optical distortion by more than 2/3 and improved sight accuracy by nearly 300% under glare-heavy conditions. The Air Force Research Division quietly drafted a post-war memo noting that a non-standard optical modification attributed to field personnel provides significant improvement in target tracking reliability under extreme light interference. The authors never mentioned his name. Rankin was just a sergeant, long gone by then, but they recognized his achievement. The note would later influence post-war turret design and the development of anti-glare coatings for aircraft optics. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the B-29 campaign reached its peak. Cities burned nightly, their fires visible hundreds of miles away. The gunners fought constantly, not just against Japanese interceptors, but against fatigue, heat, and the gnawing awareness that the war had become total. Above Tokyo, Nagoya, and Yokohama, they looked through their turrets and saw the world through Rankin's mirrors, clear, sharp, and deadly. Even in darkness, the system proved its worth. During moonlit raids, the reflection of city fires and tracer rounds could still overwhelm a gunner's sight picture. Rankin's simple adjustment allowed the human eye to filter chaos from clarity. Pilots and gunners began calling it the calm eye, the still point in a world of flame and motion. As the bombs fell, few of them thought about the man who had first taped those mirrors into place. Yet his influence lingered in every mission. Many crews painted small mirror symbols beneath their turret hatches. Some even inscribed R beside them. It wasn't superstition, it was remembrance. By July 1945, the mirror modification had become so widespread that it was quietly standardized in field manuals. Engineers replaced improvised glass with small mirrored panels fixed at mathematically determined angles. The change was never publicly acknowledged. Wartime secrecy and bureaucracy buried the story. But in the gunner's logs and maintenance notes, one phrase appeared again and again: modified Rankine system, tested and effective. The irony was profound. One man's field improvisation, born out of frustration and sunlight, had succeeded where entire laboratories of experts had not. In a war defined by massive machinery and industrial power, the smallest piece of glass had made the difference between blindness and precision. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August, the era of the Great Bomber War was ending. Yet among those who returned home, stories of the mirror trick endured. It was passed down quietly in veterans' reunions, in gunnery school, in footnotes buried in technical reports. No medals, no parades, no famous patent, just a lasting truth carried by the men who saw through fire. And as the world moved toward peace, few realized that the design principles born from one gunner's experiment in a B-29 turret would soon influence the next generation of aviation optics. Jet bombers, reconnaissance planes, and even early space instruments. William Rankin had died above the Pacific, but his reflection, both literal and symbolic, was only beginning to shine. When the war ended in August 1945, the world changed overnight. Japan surrendered, the bombers returned to their island bases, and the men who had lived for months inside aluminum shells finally walked again on still ground. For the surviving B-29 crews, it was a strange silence, a world without the constant hum of engines or the smell of burning oil. Yet even as the aircraft were mothballed or scrapped, the legacy of what had been created in their turrets was just beginning to unfold. In the post-war years, the U.S. Army Air Forces transitioned into the United States Air Force, ushering in a new age of jet technology and scientific innovation. Engineers began collecting data from every aspect of the war, from radar to gunnery, from bomb sites to optical systems. Somewhere in the stacks of reports from the Pacific Theater, analysts found the quiet documentation of a field optical improvement, a seemingly insignificant detail about mirrors in a gunner's turret. But what caught their attention was the data: measurable gains in clarity, targeting accuracy, and response time. It didn't read like a coincidence. It read like a principle. At Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, engineers began running controlled tests based on the Rankine modification. They reconstructed a B-29 turret and simulated glare conditions using powerful lamps and reflective surfaces. Their findings confirmed what the wartime data suggested. The small mirrored surfaces, when angled properly, eliminated glare by redirecting light outside the gunner's field of vision without dimming the target. This discovery would become a foundational insight in optical design for aviation and eventually aerospace. The engineers didn't know the full story. They knew only that the idea had originated in the field. The reports mentioned a name once or twice, Sergeant W. Rankin, but it was buried among hundreds of field credits, easy to overlook. Still, the results were undeniable. They incorporated the technique into post-war designs, improved gun sights, periscopic cameras, and even cockpit windshields treated with anti-reflective coatings based on the same geometry. The idea that reflection could be redirected rather than blocked became a design philosophy. Meanwhile, the men who had flown the B-29s returned home to quiet lives. Some became mechanics, others farmers, some engineers. A few continued their work in aviation, bringing with them the lessons learned at 30,000 feet. Among those lessons was one that could never be written in textbooks, that innovation in war often comes not from generals or scientists, but from the tired hands of men who refuse to accept failure. In Kansas, where William Rankin had once repaired farm machinery before the war, his name lingered in fragments. Old crewmen writing letters to his family, unit histories mentioning his mirror system, veterans recalling his calm presence under fire. His relatives received his posthumous medals, but no one outside his crew knew how much his idea had changed. To the bureaucracy, he was just another line in a casualty report. To the men who had flown behind him, he was the gunner who had given them sight when it mattered most. By the early 1950s, the concept behind Rankin's mirrors began to appear in the technical documentation of jet bombers, like the B-47 and B-52. Optical engineers developed advanced anti-glare systems inspired by field innovations of the war. The curvature of glass, the placement of reflective panels, even the coatings on canopies, all carried echoes of that simple solution taped inside a B-29 turret. The irony was almost poetic. An idea born from desperation and duct tape had become a design standard in the age of supersonic flight. In classified research papers, scientists at MIT's Radiation Laboratory and Bell Labs cited field observations from aerial gunnery units as evidence that controlled reflection could improve instrument performance. The legacy had taken root, even if the name behind it had faded into obscurity. For most who remembered him, Rankin's story wasn't about invention or glory. It was about a mindset. The willingness to look at a problem no one else would fix and solve it with what you had in front of you. In war, that kind of thinking saved lives. In peace, it built the technology of the future. The skies over Japan had long fallen silent, but every pilot who looked through a glare-free canopy, every gunner who saw clearly through an optical sight, unknowingly carried a fragment of his legacy. The reflection of one man's idea continued to shape the view from above. A faint glimmer of ingenuity born from war, carried forward into the jet age. By the late 1950s, the Air Force had moved on to sleek jet bombers and radar-guided weaponry. The old propeller-driven B-29s were long gone, their frames scrapped or relegated to target ranges. Yet in laboratories and design bureaus across the United States, the principles born from Rankin's mirror system quietly lived on. Anti-glare coatings, reflective baffles, and optical compensators had become standard in aviation. The lessons of the superfortress's blinding canopies were now embedded into the DNA of modern flight, but the man who had discovered them remained unknown. In technical archives at Wright-Patterson in the Smithsonian's Air and Space Files, engineers referred vaguely to field modifications devised by aircrew under combat conditions. The data sets credited no inventor. A handful of researchers knew that the original concept had emerged from the B-29 campaign, but Rankin's name never reached the official record. In the post-war rush to formalize research, most individual contributions were absorbed into the collective identity of the Air Force Technical Command. The mirror system was filed away as a natural development, another step in technological progress. Yet among veterans, his memory endured. At reunions of the 21st Bomber Command, aging gunners and navigators still spoke about Rankin's eyes. They told the same story, how one gunner, tired of being blinded in battle, had changed their fate with a few pieces of glass and tape. To them, it wasn't just a clever trick. It was an act of defiance against impossible odds. They remembered how his calm voice over the intercom steadied them during attacks, how his turret always seemed to see through the fire. In 1959, a military historian named Harold F. Kinsey, a former B-29 navigator, began compiling an oral history of the Pacific Air War. While interviewing survivors from Rankin's squadron, he heard the story repeatedly of the mirror system that had saved countless crews. Kinsey dug through official records, maintenance logs, and after-action reports, searching for proof. What he found were scattered references to mirror installations, improved sight clarity, and optical modifications. No technical manuals, no official commendations, just notes scribbled in field margins. Still, the evidence pointed to something real. In 1961, Kinsey published a small essay in an aviation journal titled "The Gunner Who Outsmarted the Sun." It was the first time Rankin's name appeared in print since his death. The article never reached mainstream attention, But among airmen and engineers, it sparked quiet recognition. Letters began arriving at Kinsey's office, veterans confirming the story, some enclosing photographs of turret interiors still bearing mirror mounts, others simply saying thank you. Meanwhile, optical researchers in the burgeoning field of aerospace engineering began citing early studies on light redirection and anti-glare systems, the very concepts that had originated from Rankin's battlefield experiment. The principles he'd stumbled upon found their way into jet bomber canopies, reconnaissance cameras, and even satellite optics. Decades later, NASA engineers studying how sunlight scattered across spacecraft surfaces would unknowingly rely on the same geometric truths. For the men who once flew over Japan, however, it wasn't about patents or technical evolution. It was about survival, about a time when ingenuity meant life or death. They had watched their comrades fall from the sky, seen the air ignite around them, and somehow made it home because one man refused to accept that glare was inevitable. By the time the 1960s arrived, few of those veterans were still flying. They were fathers, grandfathers, teachers, mechanics. Yet every time they looked into a rearview mirror or saw sunlight glint harmlessly off a windshield, they thought of the gunner from Kansas who had tamed the light. The Air Force archives may have forgotten his name, but the reflection of his idea lived on. In every canopy, every cockpit, every eye that looked skyward without fear of blindness. And for those who had once flown beneath the blinding Pacific sun, that was enough. By the time the 1970s arrived, the world had changed beyond recognition. Jet bombers flew higher and faster than anyone in the 1940s could have imagined. Computers now guided weapons with mathematical precision, and satellites looked down on Earth with lenses more powerful than anything Rankin's generation had dreamed of. Yet in a quiet way, the legacy of one forgotten gunner was still up there, not in metal or circuitry, but in the way light met glass. In a museum hangar at March Air Force Base, a restored B-29 stood beneath fluorescent lights. It gleamed like a ghost from another age, a machine both magnificent and terrible. One afternoon, a curator cleaning the interior of the upper turret noticed something odd fixed beneath the gun sight. A small triangle of mirrored glass, yellowed with age, its corners taped long ago. Faded writing beside it read simply, "Rankin's fix, do not remove." No one could say exactly how it had survived. The aircraft had been stripped, stored, and moved across bases for years. Yet somehow that sliver of glass, fragile, unremarkable, had endured. The curator left it in place, adding a note to the display description: field modification used by B-29 gunners to reduce glare. Visitors would pass beneath it without realizing that the little mirror had once changed the way airmen saw the war. By then, optical engineers had long incorporated Rankin's principle into the modern world. His idea that light should be redirected, not fought, lived in cockpit displays, camera systems, telescopes, and spacecraft. The anti-reflective coatings on astronaut helmets during the Apollo missions, the sun-shielding mirrors on reconnaissance satellites, even the curved visors of modern pilots, all followed the same geometry first improvised in the chaos of a Pacific bombing run. It was a quiet inheritance. No medals bore his name. No plaque commemorated him at Wright Field or Boeing. His family in Kansas received only a folded flag and a few kind letters. Yet among the small fraternity of surviving B-29 gunners, his story was legend. They told it not as a tale of invention, but as one of perspective, of a man who saw clearly when others were blinded, and who refused to accept that war's blinding light had to be fate. In 1983, at a reunion of the 21st Bomber Command in Wichita, a plaque was unveiled, in honor of Sergeant William Bill Rankin, whose courage, ingenuity, and clarity of vision saved lives and changed the way we see the sky. Many of the men present had gray hair, some walked with canes, but when they looked at the photograph of their lost comrade, the calm-eyed gunner sitting in his turret, sunlight glinting on his canopy, they felt the same gratitude they had carried for decades. The light that once threatened to blind them now seemed, in memory, softer. The war had taken millions and transformed the world. It had forged weapons of unimaginable power, but it had also given rise to small, human acts of brilliance, sparks of invention born not in laboratories, but in moments of desperation. William Rankin's mirror system was one such spark. He hadn't sought recognition or even survival. He'd simply wanted to see the enemy before the enemy saw him. And in that simple desire, that refusal to surrender to blindness, he found a truth that outlasted the war itself. That clarity, whether of vision or of thought, can change the course of history. Today, when sunlight strikes the cockpit glass of a modern aircraft and the pilot looks out without flinching, a piece of Rankin's ingenuity still shines there. A reflection of one man's stubborn brilliance high above a burning world. The mirror endures. The light still bends away. And the man who once saw clearly still helps others to see. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.